Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along. Really good attendance today. And we've got Roger Isaacs from Milsted Langdon speaking to us, who will, I'm sure, be as excellent as ever. I would say that, wouldn't I? Particularly given that Milsted Langdon work closely with the Bristol Law Society. But I must say, from a personal perspective, I've worked with him on several cases of unfair prejudice and the likes, both for business and share valuations, and he's an absolute star. We'll take questions at the end if anyone has them. You can either submit them on an ongoing basis through the Q&A function in the Zoom app, or if you put your hand up, whether probably through a press the button and put hand up, and Claire from VLS will hopefully alert us and take you off mute so you can ask them. But if we can, probably best if we keep questions till the end. In Roger's blurb, I'm showing out for this. He's putting a hitchhiker's quote. He said, "We'll be restoring normality just as soon as we're sure what is normal anyway," which is a fairly good quote, but I prefer, also from Hitchhikers, "The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't." I think that's probably going to be harder to link into the challenges of valuing a business in the current coronavirus circumstances, but I am sure that Roger will try and find a way to do so. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Roger. Thank you.
Thank you. I like nothing better than a challenge, and that really is a great challenge. So yes, where better to start than the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? And if ever there was a time when things were uncertain, it is now. For those of you who aren't fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide, there was a spaceship that was driven by a fictional engine called the Infinite Improbability Drive. And that was what was the genesis of the quotation, "We'll be restoring normality just as soon as we're sure what normal is anyway." The characters then went on to say, "We are now back to normality, and if you still have a problem with perception, that's your problem and not a problem of the universe." And that's certainly a state in which I found myself recently, getting used to the new normal. So thank you, everybody, for giving up a sunny, beautiful day to sit in front of your screens and talk about business valuation. I guess the question that I'm going to try and answer today is, how do you value a business at the moment, given all the uncertainty that exists? And the trite answer is probably, if you've got any sense, you shouldn't. Why on earth would you value it now? A much better route is to wait until the world has got back to normal, or to whatever the new normal may turn out to be, and therefore just kick the can down the road and delay. For your clients, that's unlikely to be a very attractive proposition. Your clients are going to need to get on with their lives, whether they're divorcing, whether they're engaged in litigation. Just saying come back in 2 years' time is certainly not going to be the right result for your own departments, for your own billing targets, but neither is it the right result for the clients. You've just got to try and sort things out as best you can, notwithstanding the uncertainty. So why is uncertainty so important in the context of business valuations? The answer to that is that uncertainty means risk. And when you sell a business, the one thing that the buyer is trying to minimize is the amount of risk. And when you are in a time of huge uncertainty, the dial of risk has been set much higher than it would otherwise be. And of course, if the risk goes up, investors are going to look for a higher reward. What does that mean? It means that they are going to be less willing to pay high prices for businesses because they are more risky, but also the ratio of the reward to the price that they're paying changes as the risk goes up. They'll pay less because they will expect a greater reward, or for a given reward, they will be willing to take less risk. Most of you will be familiar with that ratio between risk and reward. Effectively, the higher the risk, the greater an investor will want the return to be. The lower the risk, the lower the return needs to be. Well, if you ever want to see what risk and reward looks like in the real world, just look at the state of the stock markets of the world. And as you can see from this graph, and as you probably all know, following the coronavirus pandemic, the stock markets plummeted. They have currently bounced back, although I'm not entirely sure why, because it seems to me that the world is still pretty uncertain, and yet the markets haven't come back to where they were. But the Dow Jones is approaching an all-time high at the moment. So after this graph, the rise has continued. But I think the position is perhaps somewhat different when you look at unquoted companies, small family businesses. And here are some multiples comparing the figures in brackets, which were the April mean multiples, and those in May. And as you can see, I would ignore the minority deal row, but if you look at the mergers and acquisition row, the estimated earnings to value stroke EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization ratios, those are the figures that are probably the most relevant. And if you look at the top right hand box, you can see the median multiple for companies that were being bought and sold in April was 9.4, and that had fallen to 7.2, which is a very significant reduction by May. Similarly, the average, the arithmetic mean fell from 10.5 to 7.7. And if you look at the ratio of earnings to turnover, you similarly see a reduction. Looking left to the left hand two columns, the median fell from 2.1 in April to only 1.8 in May. Now, I would take those figures with a slight degree of caution because they are based on a relatively small population, but they nevertheless tell you what you would expect to find, which is that as uncertainty goes up, risk goes up, and the multiples correspondingly come down. Another way, of course, of talking about multiples, if you're doing a valuation based on a discounted cash flow, is that the discount rate that you apply to future cash flows increases with the greater amount of risk. Of course, there are firms, private equity firms in particular, that have got stacks of cash and that are out there at the moment looking for a bargain. So just because we're in the height of the crisis, or hopefully the tail end of the crisis, or if one is a realist, perhaps the midst of the crisis, that doesn't mean that there will be no purchases and sales of businesses. And private equity is a prime example of an area where there's lots of cash, and if businesses can be bought that have a reasonable prospect of delivering sensible profits over the medium term, there are cash chests with which to acquire them. But I guess the question is, never mind about who wants to buy the business, who actually in their right mind would want to sell a business today? And of course, that has to be built into any valuation, because if you can't sell something, then arguably, how can it realistically have any value whatsoever? So why would you sell a business today? If you're a seller, surely you would wait until things were a bit more certain. And to a degree, I think that's true. But there are a number of people who find that actually delay isn't the right answer. Not necessarily a distressed sale because the company is in distress, but often there can be shareholder disputes or divorces, all sorts of reasons why there is an imperative to sell a business sooner rather than later, and delay just isn't an option. So that there is still business activity, as you can see from this slide, which shows the number of deals that actually got over the line over the last few months. And unsurprisingly, in April and May, the volumes were way down on what they'd been in previous months, but they didn't fall to nothing. And in fact, the fact that in May 2020, 142 businesses were sold is perhaps quite a surprising statistic. One might have thought there were no businesses being sold whatsoever, but in fact, the evidence is that that isn't the case. Now, many of those business sales, of course, will have been fairly far advanced before the pandemic hit, and therefore there's perhaps a lag, and I suspect that that number will continue to drop off and reduce further over the forthcoming months before eventually, hopefully starting to track back up again. So if you're going to value a business, where on earth do you start? And I guess the best place to start is with what you do know. So if you're looking at a business, you have to say, well, what did it look like in the days before COVID-19, if anybody can remember that far back into history? And the starting point, I think, is that the pre-COVID valuation. And the next thing one has to do is say, well, how has the business been affected so far? And it ought to be possible to tell certainly what the sales have been, and arguably what the profits or losses have been in March, in April, in May, and by the end of this month, June figures ought to be available for most businesses as well. Never has there been a time when accurate, up-to-date management accounts have been as important as they are now. Typically, when I'm valuing businesses, I get provided with end-of-year accounts, and as long as they're not ridiculously out of date, it's those on which I rely rather than the management accounts, because they will have been through the hands of the business auditor or the business accountant, and all the end-of-year adjustments, accruals, prepayments, depreciation adjustments, and so on and so forth would have been put through, which tends to make them much more reliable than the figures that are produced if you just press a button in an accounting package like Sage or Xero and try and get a set of management accounts from the data that's just been entered into the system on a monthly basis on the basis of the invoices and the banking transactions. But these days, that's really not good enough. If the year end was in February 2020, that won't tell you how the business has fared during the pandemic. And that's why it's really important now more than ever that if you're valuing a business, you've got up-to-date accounts so you can really understand how the business has been affected, what's happened to the sales, what's happened to the profits. And many businesses have been applying for some sort of funding from the government or otherwise. This slide, you see our Chancellor talking about the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loans, or CBILS, which have had a huge take-up. And one of the things that businesses will have produced if they were going to apply for funding is almost inevitably a cash flow forecast. And these cash flow forecasts are hugely helpful for the purposes of valuing businesses. And I've certainly noticed in the last few weeks and months that whereas in the past, if I said, can I have a look at your cash flow forecast, I'd have been told we don't produce them. Even the smallest businesses with the most rudimentary accounting systems are now producing cash flow forecasts. And they're doing so out of necessity, because managing the cash during the pandemic has become front and center of their minds. And they've recognized the importance of understanding what their cash flow is going to look like to make sure that they can apply for finance or know how long they can survive without needing injections of capital. And those cash flow forecasts are again, hugely important for the purposes of any valuation, because they give a great inkling as to what the business owners think is likely to take place over the next few months. What are the prospects for the business? Now, there are occasionally businesses that say, we've got no idea, we've got absolutely no idea what the future holds, and we're not going to produce cash flow forecasts, and how can we possibly guess the future? But as I say, the number of businesses that fall into that category is a relatively small proportion compared with what one would see in more normal times. So you have the management accounts, which tells you how the business has been affected since the end of the last financial year, over the last few months during the pandemic. And you've got a cash flow forecast, which ought to give you some indication as to how the business owner thinks the performance of the business will be over the next few months. The next thing you need to address is what will the multiple be, or if you're doing a discounted cash flow, what will the discount rate be? And as I've said, multiples will be lower, but of course not in every case. There are some companies that have actually done well. We're having this conversation on Zoom, and Zoom, I heard in the news today, has had a 20-fold increase in sales. Some of those users of Zoom are actually paying to use the service, albeit a small number, but you only need a small percentage of the millions and millions of people that are using Zoom to have resulted in a huge increase in revenue and profits for that business. But Amazon, Netflix doing fantastically well, whereas of course Pret-a-Manger is on the other side of the scale. John Lewis really struggling at the moment. Yes, they've got an online presence, but to what extent is that making up for the vast amount of rent and rates and the infrastructure costs that they have to pay for their shops? So it's really important not to treat all companies the same. Some will be relatively unaffected by the pandemic, some will be positively benefiting, and many, of course, are struggling. It seems to me, therefore, that you need to understand 4 things in order to work out what multiple to apply or what discount rate to apply. And they are these. The first is, have you got a business that is still viable? Is there a prospect that the business may simply fail? And if there is a prospect that the business might fail, how likely is that? Is that a 10% chance or a 90% chance? And that's probably the most important question to start with, because ultimately, if you're looking at a distressed sale, a liquidation sale, obviously that will probably overshadow all other aspects of the valuation, and you need to be approaching it from a breakup perspective rather than from a going concern perspective. And certainly my audit partners are spending a lot of time at the moment looking at businesses before they sign off audit reports to work out whether they are viable going concerns, because it's not only embarrassing but also can be quite expensive if an auditor signs off an audit report on a company that goes bust very soon afterwards when there's no reference to that in the financial statements. So it's not just a matter of failure or success, it's a matter of survival or otherwise. So will the business you're looking at be viable? And again, the cash flow forecast, the funding applications that may have been made, it helped to inform that decision about viability. The next issue is how big are the losses that have been incurred since the lockdown began? And they need to be assessed not just for determining whether the business itself is viable, but also those losses, if they're going to continue, obviously affect the price that any buyer is likely to pay for the business. If I buy a business tomorrow and I know that I've got to inject £500,000 just to fund its losses until it once again returns to profit, I will on average pay £500,000 less for that business than I would if I were buying the same business which wasn't going to incur those losses. So the price, pound for pound pretty much, will reduce for any short-term losses that need to be funded during the period in which the trade is adversely affected. And again, for determining those losses, the cash flow forecasts are invaluable. If you've decided that the business can recover, the next question is, to what extent will it bounce back? Is it likely to get back to where it was before the pandemic? Is it likely to get back to 80% of where it was? Or is it likely actually to get back and to exceed its financial performance before the pandemic? And again, that question is often answered on percentage terms. One might say it is entirely probable that the business will make a full recovery. It is possible the business will make a full recovery. It is doubtful that the business can make a full recovery. And each of those statements, depending on which they are, have an effect on the multiple. The greater the prospect of recovery, the less is the need to reduce the multiple that you would have applied had it not been for the pandemic in the first place. And these are, of course, all subjective issues of judgment, but at least I'm of the view that you can provide a relatively logical and objective framework within which to apply them. And then once you've assessed whether or not the business will bounce back, the next question is, how long will that recovery take? Clearly, the longer that a business takes to recover, again, the more adversely affected will be its value. And again, it's hugely uncertain at the moment as to how long any business will take to recover, whether we have a V-shaped recovery or a W-shaped recovery, whether we have a second wave, no one knows. But some sort of assessment has to be made in terms of the length of time for the recovery. So in summary, what I advocate doing is to start with what you know. Start with the pre-COVID valuation of the business. What would the business have been worth had COVID never come along? Then think about the multiple. That multiple may well need to be reduced for various reasons. Firstly, there is simply just general economic uncertainty in the market, so multiples generally will be lower. Secondly, you need to consider whether there are any specific risk factors of the business that mean that it may not anymore be viable. Thirdly, what are the prospects of it getting back to where it was before, to making a full recovery, or is it more likely that it will only partially recover, and how long will that recovery take? Once you've factored all those elements into your revised multiple, you then need to consider what you think the earnings are likely to be once it's achieved that recovery, the medium to long-term earnings. And that enables you to work out a new capitalized earnings figure, either by using the discounted cash flow or simply applying an adjusted multiple. And finally, if you think that there are going to be any losses incurred between the date of the last financial statements, or effectively, no, well, depending on where your starting point is, either the date of the last financial statements or the date on which you're doing the valuation, and the date on which the company returns to profit, you have to make an adjustment for those short-term losses. So let's bring all that together. This slide is here to reflect the fact that I recently, last week, was giving evidence in court talking about the valuation of a children's nursery. And that was an interesting case because I was being asked to deal with all the issues that I've just been speaking about. Of course, being able to give any definitive answers was quite difficult, but I would like to think that the court was assisted by at least having a framework with which to apply some of these principles to get to a sensible value of the business. What's really interesting about a children's nursery, this was a business which had received indicative offers before the pandemic for £5 million. So it was at that point a valuable business. So one then needs to say, well, think about, well, what's happened since the pandemic? How has that affected it? And on the plus side, I was told by the business owner, who was trying to tell me that the business was in a terrible state. And to demonstrate that, said, well, 25% of local nurseries in Bristol have gone into liquidation. Well, so why am I putting that in the positive side of the equation? Well, the answer is, of course, that's 25% less competition. So on a Darwinistic basis, if this business was able to survive, and there was every sign that it would survive, then one would expect it to benefit after the crisis, because there would simply be less competition, and therefore more children fighting to go to fewer nursery spaces. Similarly, we are living in a world where it's quite possible, especially if there's a second wave, that grandparents will continue to shield and may well be less willing to undertake childcare than they were in the past. And if they're less willing to undertake childcare, well, then there ought to be a greater demand for nurseries. And as I say, this business had managed to remain open and profitable throughout the pandemic, which put it in a great position to benefit from the upswing if and when it came. On the other hand, there was the risk of the second spike, and in cross-examination, I got asked, what did I think about that? To which I had to reply, well, that's not a matter of accountancy. Ultimately, the judge is as capable as I am as to work out what are the prospects of a second spike, and clearly that would be disastrous for almost every business. Then there is certainly a risk that unemployment rates are going to increase. And if they do, there's the question as to whether people are going to be able to afford nursery accommodation as they have done in the past, or whether actually demand will reduce just because people will find nurseries unaffordable. And of course, people are now working much more at home, and the argument was put to me as to whether that could also reduce demand for nursery spaces, although talking to colleagues and others over recent months, those who are working from home seem to think that having their children at a nursery would be a huge advantage compared with having them crawling around at their feet while they're trying to concentrate on Zoom calls. So I'm not sure which side of the equation that should properly sit on. So all of these factors have to be thought about, and they have to be factored into the valuation. In conclusion, I would say that, and in fact, in the case last week, I did say any valuation in the current climate has to be treated with caution. It was put to me that meant that my valuation wasn't worth the paper it was written on. I wouldn't, of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? I wouldn't go quite that far. But I think what it means is that if my colleagues in the corporate finance team were asked to sell a business tomorrow and had to sell it within the next 4 to 6 weeks, they'd probably really struggle to find anyone willing to buy most businesses, with the odd exception. On the other hand, if we don't get a second spike and they were given 6 to 12 months to market a business, I suspect that business activity will return to some semblance of normality by 2021. So when you ascribe a value to the business, you're ascribing it on the basis that it may take quite some time to realize. So hopefully that's given you a few thoughts about the sorts of principles that should be applied to valuing businesses in the current climate. I'm sure Ben has been busily collecting questions. If not, we'll all be able to go and munch our lunches. But I will stop my screen sharing.
Thank you, Roger. I'll just double check. I don't think we have any questions submitted on the Q&A function unless my iPad is playing up. I'll kick us off though, just in terms of some thoughts, if anyone else has any questions in the meantime, just in terms of whether essentially, obviously it's a global pandemic, would do the same principles apply in international cases?
That's a good question, and it's extraordinary how, if I look at the transactions that our corporate finance team have been dealing with over the last 12 months, a few years ago it was very, very rare to get an international case. Now they are the norm, and probably at least half of the transactions that go through where we're selling small West Country businesses have buyers from overseas. And whereas the assessment of a multiple used to be something that was country specific, now there really is a genuine global marketplace. And the multiples that apply here are quite similar to those that apply elsewhere in the Western world. I see there's a question about pre-revenue valuations. So one of the hardest things ever to value is a company that hasn't yet made a profit, or in a more extreme case, a company that hasn't even sold anything yet, that is developing a product. And I think there are two yardsticks for valuing businesses like that. The first is that some of those businesses have attracted investment. And if they've recently attracted investment, that's a great indicator of what somebody thinks they're worth. I mean, at the end of the day, the old adage that something is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it is absolutely true. So if somebody's bought 10% of a business for £1 million 2 weeks ago, that gives you a good indication, before you worry about minority discounts and all the rest of it, as to the value of that business. So the first thing is, has anybody invested, and if so, on what basis and at what price? If they've invested on the basis of fantastic projections that have not then been fulfilled, you can look and compare the actual performance with the projected performance and reduce the value of the business accordingly. But if nobody's invested and you've got a pre-revenue business, the only thing you can do is to produce your best guess as to what its financial performance will be by way of financial projections, and then apply an appropriate discount rate. But of course, discount rates that apply to pre-revenue startups are much higher than those that apply to other companies, simply because those that are likely to buy those sorts of companies are the venture capitalists who will be looking for very high rates of return, because they work on the basis that many of the businesses they buy will fail, but on a portfolio approach, they'll manage to kiss enough frogs that they'll find one or two princes.
Thank you. We've had a follow-up question from Megan Jeffries on the international query. In terms of on the basis of your response, would it be appropriate to look at similar businesses in different jurisdictions who are ahead of us on the recovery curve?
That's a good question, and the answer, I think, it goes back to the frogs point. You kiss as many frogs as you can, and certainly my firm, we use various international marketplaces and forums, and on a confidential basis, you can market a business very easily on a global scale now, and it's surprising where you find buyers in the most unusual of places, and undoubtedly some buyers will be in countries that are coming out of lockdown, and you're more likely to find buyers there than countries that are behind it. But ultimately, I would always advise, cast the net as wide as possible.